My younger sister always needed extra support. I was always expected to understand. Last month, I compared timelines out loud for the first time. They said I was keeping score. Posted to r/true off my chest. I want to start with the number. The number is 14. That is how old I was when I first heard the phrase extra support used in reference to my sister B. My mother used it on a phone call I was not supposed to be listening to, one of those childhood overheard conversations that lodges somewhere permanent because you understand it better than you were supposed to. She was talking to my aunt. She said B was going through a hard time and needed extra support, and that she hoped I would understand. I was 14. B was 10. Understanding was presented to me as the appropriate response to a situation I had not been consulted about, and I did what 14-year-olds do when the people they love present them with an expectation framed as a hope. I understood. I have been understanding for 22 years. I am 36 now. Last month I stopped understanding quietly and started saying what I knew out loud. My family told me I was keeping score. I want to tell you what the score actually is and what keeping it means and why those two things are not the same. My name is Elena. B is my younger sister by 4 years. She is 32. She is, genuinely, a person who has faced real difficulty. I want to say that clearly, as I have learned to say it clearly in my head, because the realness of her difficulty is not in question. What is in question, and has been in question for 22 years without ever being examined directly, is the distribution of family resources around that difficulty and what it produced for both of us. BEA's difficulties have taken different shapes at different times. At 10, it was the hard time my mother mentioned on the phone, a period of anxiety and school avoidance that required my parents' sustained attention for most of that year. At 14, it was a depressive episode that led to her first therapist, her first medication, the reorganization of our household around her stability. At 17, it was a crisis significant enough to require a brief hospitalization. At 22, it was a period of substance use that my parents managed largely in secret, or what they thought was secret, while I watched from 4 hours away and was told only what they decided I needed to know. These things happened. They were real. B suffered, and my parents responded to her suffering with the full weight of their love and their resources, and I believe that was the right thing to do. I also believe something else, which I have been believing quietly for 22 years, and which I finally said out loud last month. While all of that was happening, I was also a person. I was a person who had needs that were, in comparison to BEA's, quiet and consistent and easily overlooked. I was a person who was handed the role of the one who understands before I was old enough to have chosen it. And I have been living inside that role ever since, without anyone asking whether it fit. Let me give you the texture of it because I think texture is what makes the difference between a grievance and an understanding. When I was 16 and going through what I now recognize as a significant period of anxiety, not clinical, not hospitalization level, but real and daily and affecting my sleep and my concentration and my ability to enjoy being 16, I did not tell my parents. I did not tell them because I had learned, by then, that the emotional bandwidth of our household was allocated, and the allocation had been made before I arrived at the table to ask for anything. BEA's needs had a standing reservation. Mine were walk-ins, and the restaurant was always full. I managed the anxiety myself, in the practiced way of someone who has understood from an early age that self-management is what is expected of her. I got through it. I was fine. The fineness became evidence that I did not need the things I had not asked for, which is the circular logic that sustained the whole system. When I was 20 and applying for a graduate program, I needed a letter of reference from a professor who was difficult to reach. I asked my mother once if she had any advice. She had been through a graduate application process herself decades prior. She said she would think about it and get back to me. She did not get back to me. I tracked down the letter myself. The same week, my mother drove 3 hours to help me move apartments after a difficult breakup. I moved into my graduate housing with the help of 2 friends and a rented van. When I was 26 and going through a painful end to a long relationship, I called my parents twice. My mother was sympathetic and then pivoted to something B was going through that she needed to process. My father said he was sorry and asked if I was eating. I said yes. He said good. We got off the phone. I was not fine. I said I was. When I was 29 and bought my first apartment, my parents came to see it and said it was lovely. They did not help with the deposit or the move or the setup. When B, at 27, was looking for a place to live after a period of instability, my parents co-signed her lease and paid her first 2 months of rent and helped her furnish the main room. None of these individual instances is, on its own, a case I am making. Together they are a pattern, and the pattern has a direction, and the direction has been the same for 22 years. The timeline comparison happened at a Sunday dinner, which was not planned as the venue for this conversation, but became it anyway in the way that unplanned venues often do. My parents, BEA's boyfriend, and me. A normal dinner, in the way that dinners in families with a long history of navigating around certain things are normal on the surface. The conversation was easy. Food was good. And then my mother, in the warm and unself-conscious way of someone sharing family news, mentioned that she and my father had decided to help me with a car. B needed reliable transportation for a new job. They felt it was the right time to support her. They were going to co-sign a loan. I received this information. I said, "That's kind of you." My mother said, "We want to make sure she gets established." I said, "How much support have you extended to B over the years, financially? Compared to me?" The table went a specific, kind of quiet. I said, "I'm not asking rhetorically. I'm asking because I've never asked and I think I should have asked a long time ago, and I want to understand the actual number." My father said, "Elena, this isn't." I said, "I know it's uncomfortable. I'm not trying to make it a fight. I'm asking a factual question because I think the answer is relevant." My mother said, "We've helped both of you." I said, "You paid BEA's first 2 months of rent at 27. You co-signed her previous lease. You paid for her therapy for 3 years. I know because you mentioned the cost once when you were stressed about money. You helped her during the period when she was using financially in ways I only partially know about. You've contributed to her various moving costs 4 times. I paused. When I moved into my graduate housing, I had 2 friends and a rented van. When I bought my apartment, you came to see it. Those are the things I can name specifically. B said, "Are you seriously doing this right now?" I said, "I'm describing factual events." She said, "You're keeping score." There it was. The sentence I had been expecting and dreading and had known was coming since I first opened my mouth. You're keeping score. I want to stay with that sentence because I think it deserves full examination. Keeping score implies that I have been tracking things for the purpose of using them against someone. It implies that the tracking itself is the problem, that a person who remembers what happened is doing something wrong by remembering, that the act of naming the pattern is the offense rather than the pattern itself. But I had not been tracking these things with a ledger and a plan. I had been living inside them. The 2 months of rent, the co-sign leases, the therapy payments, I did not catalog these things deliberately. I knew them because I was present for the family that contained them, because I heard the conversations I wasn't supposed to hear at 14, and have been hearing versions of them ever since, because when you are the sibling who understands, you develop a thorough, involuntary knowledge of exactly what you have been understanding all these years. Remembering what happened to you is not keeping score. It is having a memory. I said this. Not in exactly those words. The words came to me more clearly later in the quiet of my own apartment, in the way that the precise thing you needed to say always arrives slightly after the moment you needed to say it. But the version I had at the table was close enough. I said, "Keeping score implies I've been cataloging these things to use them against you. I haven't. I know them because they happened to me. Knowing what happened to you isn't keeping score. It's just knowing." My father said, "No one meant for it to be unequal." I said, "I know that." I said, "What I want you to hear is that it was unequal, regardless of what was meant. And that the inequality was sustained for 22 years partly because I was always the one who understood, and understanding kept me from ever saying any of this, and I have been paying for the understanding with things I needed and didn't get." My mother's eyes were wet. She said, "You never said anything." I said, "I know. I'm saying it now." B was quiet. Not the defensive quiet of a moment earlier. A different kind. I did not know what it meant, and I did not press on it. The dinner ended shortly after. Not an explosion, just in the careful, contained way of a meal that has become something more than a meal and that everyone needs to go home and sit with. I am not going to tell you the conversation resolved everything because it did not. My mother called me the following week, and the call was difficult in the way of a call between a parent and child when something long unspoken has been spoken. She said she had been thinking about what I said. She said she had not realized the extent of the imbalance. She said she was sorry. I said, I believe you didn't mean for it to be this way. She said, does that matter? I said, it matters for how I feel about you. It doesn't change what happened. She said, what do you need from us now? I said, I need you to know it happened. I need it to be in the room rather than under the room. I need that when you make decisions about supporting me going forward, you ask yourself whether the same decision would have been made for me, and if the answer is no, to ask why. She said, that's fair. She said it simply. No qualification. B texted me 4 days after the dinner. She said, I've been thinking about what you said. I didn't know some of those things. I knew you had it easier than me, I thought. I thought that was just because you were more capable. She paused, which I could feel in the text even though texts don't pause. I think I want to talk to you. Not about the dinner exactly. Just talk. Like sisters. I wrote back. I'd like that. We haven't had the call yet. It's scheduled for next Sunday. I don't know what it will produce. I know that she texted, which is more than I expected, and that the text acknowledged something rather than defending against it. I want to close with the thing I have been sitting with most since the dinner. For 22 years I understood. I understood because I was asked to, and because asking was framed as hoping, and because I loved my family, and because understanding felt like the right contribution I could make to a household that was managing something real and hard. I do not regret all of the understanding. Some of it was the right thing, and some of it was love. What I regret is the silence underneath the understanding. The 16-year-old managing her own anxiety in a house that had no bandwidth for it. The graduate student tracking down her own reference letter. The 26-year-old saying, yes, I'm fine. I'm eating, into a phone when she was not fine. Those silences were not chosen from strength. They were chosen from a system that had communicated clearly and consistently that my needs were the walk-ins in a restaurant where someone else had the standing reservation. I said it out loud. They called it keeping score. I am going to keep saying it anyway because the thing about not keeping score is that the game keeps going whether you count it or not. The score exists. The only question is whether you are allowed to name it. I am naming it. I am keeping the name. Edit. My father called me this week, separately from my mother, without being asked. He said he had been going back through his memory of the last 20 years, and he could see the pattern I was describing, and he was ashamed he hadn't seen it sooner. He said ashamed himself. He didn't say disappointed or sorry or wish things had been different. He said ashamed, which is a word that means he is locating it in himself rather than in the circumstances. I told him I appreciated him calling. I meant it. Edit 2, the call with B happened. It was 1 hour and 40 minutes. She said something in the middle of it that I am still thinking about. I always thought you were fine because you were fine. I didn't think about the fact that you were fine because there was no other option. I said, there was no other option. She said, I'm sorry you were my other option. We were both quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to be your sister. Not your burden and not your excuse. Actually your sister. I said, I want that too. I think we meant it. I think we are figuring out what it looks like. That's enough to start with.